there! I am Zolerla, and this is The Joy of Computer Gaming, where we investigate intriguing and good examples of computer gaming history. Today's highlighted game is Rescue on Fractalus, the procuring pilots precariously parked below the planet's peaks, pelting pesky emplacements and ponderous pods, and powering up to pop up into the mothership, providing passengers for points gained. Pretty impressive pop filter, eh? Anyways, it was created by Lucasfilm Games and published by Epyx, originally on the Atari 8-bit, the version I played, Commodore 64 and Apple II in 1985, on the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum and Atari 5200 in 1986, and the TRS-80 CoCo in 1987. I even found an Atari 7800 prototype with a copyright of 1984, and also a modern fan remake of it with version 1.0 that came out in December of 2020 for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, named simply Fractalus. For many people playing computer games back in the early 80s, this was the very first time, and unfortunately the last time for many years, that we got to experience flying around 3D terrain in a fairly versatile ship, and it was also a fun game to play as well. The entire experience was just astounding for the time. This was also one of the very first games with several moments that mess with you emotionally, but we'll get to that. This game in particular shows off what an Atari 8-bit could do well that other computers at the time simply could not. We'll see and hear that more clearly when we get to the versions, but it's one heck of a difference. An introduction sequence with a bizarre-looking mothership introduces us to our base for the game, showing occasional ships flying out before we're brought into our own ship, waiting on the hangar as a means of selecting the level to play. When we start a level, the hangar door opens and we thrust forward, out into space, and we see the world below us as our autopilot makes its descent. You can even see the curvature of the planet slowly changing as you're approaching the world. The planet here is why in my Ultima 2 video I said that they should have shown the world you were orbiting, because it adds a lot of character to this. And don't tell me it was because Ultima 2 was originally on the Apple II, because here's Rescue on Fractalus on the Apple II doing a simplified version of this. When we get through the atmosphere, we're greeted with a full 3D rendered world of fractally generated terrain where we'll be searching for pilots to rescue. The screen refreshes every 8 to 12 frames on NTSC computers, giving us about 7 frames per second, which was phenomenal at the time. This is what set the game apart when it came out, and it was amazing to see. This sort of 3D perspective was only barely utilized by a few games at the time on the Atari, such as Flight Simulator 2 from 1984, which, if you were lucky, ran at 1 frame a second, and F-15 Strike Eagle, also from 1984, which was so simplistic in comparison. The first flight simulator on the Apple II from 1980 was almost impossible to play, but sort of did what this game does, and even then, its frame rate was a crawl. In fact, for me, I didn't see anything like this again other than the other Lucasfilm games, until Captain Blood came out in 1988 for the far more powerful Atari ST, but there's no rolling in that game, so it's only a pseudo 3D game. It also only uses wireframe when flying. In fact, the closest I ever got to Rescue on Fractalus back in the day was playing the simplistic 3D racing game Stunts, which came out in 1990 for MS-DOS and actually did have rolling in it, like going through a corkscrew. And even later with flight simulators like Aces of the Pacific in 1992. Rescue on Fractalus seriously was so far ahead when it came out. It even faded out the scenery at high altitudes, which was a cool effect. The game also had a demo droid mode built into it that allowed Atari users to run it and show off what an Atari 8-bit could do. In 1984, when this game was supposed to come out, this was a big deal. There is a brief story in the manual for the plot of the game. The year is 2184 and there is a war raging on the world of Fractalus with the Jahagari Kachaki, or Jaggies for short. You're an air pilot who's been recruited to pilot a modified Valkyrie aircraft with a mission to rescue space pilots from the Ether Core who got shot down and are stranded on the planet's surface. Apparently, these pilots did great in the battle in space, but down on the planet they don't know aerial combat very well and are faring fairly badly. The manual doesn't mention how long the war's been going on, but it mentions air pilots were being phased out just 5 years ago, so it hasn't been long. The game had a prototype named Behind Jaggy Lines, which was a pun because the lines of the mountains are so jaggy looking at low resolution, and Fractalus is just us added to the end of Fractal, which is the type of terrain generation being used. In any case, what is interesting here about the story of your part in the game is that you're not here to kill enemies. You're not here to fight glorious battles or defeat the bad guys. You're here to rescue other pilots that have crashed because of the war they've been fighting in. Now, I normally wait until the next section to mention world details, but It's so integral to the story I'm going to bring it up here. The planet Fractalus has a high rate of rotation, with 9-minute days. The game itself reflects this on higher levels, saying that the lower levels with only daylight start near the poles, and the later levels are closer to the equator where the day-night cycles are really noticeable. The planet also has a cyanitric acid atmosphere, a made-up term that I guess is supposed to make you think of cyanide. It dissolves the pilots' flight suits if they ever leave their ships, but even their ships are slowly getting devoured by the hostile environment. Like I brought up in my Alibaba episode where the princess just vanished. I really enjoy little bits of flavor these old games added where they could. Here, I like the final message they included from Lieutenant Malura because it hints at other things that the manual doesn't include, and it reminds me of the sort of audio log you'd hear in a more modern game. Lieutenant Malura to Mothership, I hope you can read me. I've been down here in this atmosphere so long it's starting to get to me. I kept the airlocks closed as best I could, but they were pretty torn up. During the nights, I see brief flashes as other ships fall to the surface, but during the days, there's nothing to see but this awful acid smog. I had my shields on for a while until I realized the Jaggies could still track me. I'd fry anyone trying to rescue me, so I turned them off and waited. You'll never believe how lonely it is down here, waiting. But it's not quiet. The acid makes a continuous sizzling sound, very faint, but always there, as it eats away at the hull of my ship. Hey, what's that? I think I see a pilot running towards me. I knew you guys wouldn't let me down. Wait, there's something wrong here. He doesn't look quite right. His helmet's green? Commander, we don't have any... My God! It's going to... Ah! The world of Fractalus is incredibly hostile to humans. As I said, the air is thick cyanitric acid, a portmanteau of cyanide and nitric, that eats away at anything in it and requires a computer-enhanced view screen to let your ship even see through it. Other than the enemies, the Jaggies, the world is just tons of mountains and canyons. It's amazing the Jaggies even want to live there at all. To show the day-night cycle in the game, I have it massively sped up here, and you can see the scene getting darker and darker. Let me jump ahead a bit, it gets pitch black, and then you could see the scene getting lighter and lighter. It's a neat effect. Flying around in the game feels great, so long as you tolerate the frame rate. The controls are arcade-like, where pressing left and right rotates your craft in the respective direction, with a little bit of a roll effect, but flight sim-like in that pressing down pitches you upward and up pitches you downwards. You use the fire buttons to fire your antimatter bubble or AMB torpedo, which destroys targets in an area around where it hits. You can land if you're low enough to the ground by pressing L, disable or enable your systems if landed with S, open and close your airlock if your systems are disabled with A, and increase or decrease your throttle with the left and right arrows while flying. In general, I didn't feel the need to increase the throttle, and it only slightly increases your speed anyways. If the mothership is in range and you're high enough, you can press B to use your boosters to fly off the planet and let autopilot pull you back onto the mothership. The cockpit of your Valkyrie ship has a lot of lights and gauges that actually serve a purpose. This aspect alone is pretty cool and helps you navigate the world of Fractalus. Up top we have a text area for messages, a score, and compass for directions. Down below, starting from the left, the first set of lights is our throttle from 0 when landed to 8 at full speed. The second set of lights is how close the ground is to the bottom of the ship, with all lights lit when landed. These two lines show how close the mountains are on either side of the ship. This is the artificial horizon, which tells you what angle your roll and pitch are. This shows the ground's height from sea level in purple and your ship's altitude in light blue. This screen here is a zoom in of targets to help with aiming, though crosshairs will appear in the main view if an enemy is near the center of it. These lights will randomly flicker a lot of the time as they're scanning for enemy locks. It'll clear out and then tick off and fill in if an enemy gun emplacement starts getting a lock on you. Before it fills up, take evasive maneuvers. This is your ship's energy in green. Your ship will be destroyed if it runs out. This is the long-range radar for finding ships with life signs in them. It beeps as you get closer to the ship and flashes and chirps when a ship is within range to rescue the pilot. Over here, this light flickers or turns on when the shields are expecting you to get hit, or you're very near land, letting you know when they're draining energy from the ship to protect you. This middle light flashes when the mothership is near enough to boost her up to. You'll also hear a unique sound when it gets into range. The last light is when your airlock is open. Not recommended unless picking up a pilot. The R here is the range to the nearest pilot in front of you. This is a 0 if none are detected. The E is the number of enemies you've taken out. This isn't your primary goal, but the ship does track it. And the P here is your quota of pilots to complete the level if it isn't flashing, or how many extra pilots past your quota that you have rescued if it is flashing. For me, with all of these UI elements on the ship to help you tell your position, it's a bit odd that there is nothing to tell you how close land is in front of you. Normally you can just tell by looking, but when you're flying around at night and everything is pitch black, this would have been really useful. Thankfully, it's only this dark for about a minute. Rescue on Fractalus looks fairly calm at low levels, but at high levels there are numerous gun emplacements and occasional flying saucers to interrupt our travels, and while we can shoot them, there always seems to be more of them. The gun emplacements never move and are generally terrible aims, but if you move slow enough, you can hear some sound ticking off, and these dots light up at the bottom of the console. That means a turret is getting a lock on you. If you don't take evasive maneuvers, zap! Turrets hitting you can also knock you a bit off course, which is a neat touch. Shooting a gun emplacement is weird and doesn't feel quite right, and the manual even suggests trying to get behind it to shoot it if you're having trouble hitting it, or a random shot from Ultima 3 can come out of nowhere and hit one. Okay, how long have I been holding on to that brick joke? 6 years now? Where was I? Right. Flying saucers, on the other hand, just try to ram you. You can weave around as it approaches to dodge them, or you can try your luck at hitting them. If they hit you, they could do a lot of damage and knock you way off course. You can technically hide from enemies if you need a breather. Just land and turn off your systems. No, really, they can no longer see you, shoot you, or even hold a lock on you once you do. I didn't find this out until I was trying to answer some Outlier questions for my extra section. You can also use this tactic to cheese your way through the darkness by landing before it gets pitch black, and then turning off your systems. Remember, enemies won't attack you when your systems are off, so you can just calmly wait a minute or two for the darkness to go away. Ready to continue. Killing enemies isn't really the goal of the game. Except at really high levels, the game's not quite as hectic as full-on shooters of the time, such as River Raid for the 2600 or Blue Max on the Atari 8-bit. More thematically similar is The Last Starfighter, though it still feels a lot more frenetic in comparison, especially when the fighters are attacking. Your real goal is rescuing downed pilots. Actually completing a rescue takes a number of steps. Clear out the enemies in the vicinity, land within a range of 2 of the ship, make certain you're aiming in its direction, disable your ship's systems and shield. Then, a pilot will come out of the ship and run towards you. If you listen, you can even hear the footsteps of the pilot as they run up to your ship. When they get to your ship, they will loudly knock on the airlock if it isn't open, and you can then hear them climbing in. There are reasons to keep your airlock closed until they knock, though I'll bring that up later. They'll automatically close the airlock behind them and give you some energy from their ship to heal you a bit, and some points. Then you can take off by increasing your thrusters, which enables your systems and shield as well. Optionally, you could also destroy the pilot's ship after you take off. The manual recommends you do this to avoid letting the ship fall into enemy hands. If you turn on your systems, or take off while a pilot is running up to your ship and not safely in it, you'll fry them, killing them instantly. Maybe don't do that? It took a bit out of me to even record this, but one of the saddest things you could do here is just choose not to open your airlock at all, and you can hear their knocking slows down more and more until they die to the hostile environment. It's just an NPC in a video game, but this is poignant. Okay. On rare occasion, one of the pilots you can rescue and hopefully not murder will have a purple helmet and have an announcement that this is the ace. You get 10 times as many points and a lot more energy from rescuing an ace, though it seems to be completely random when one shows up. After some time on a level, the game will alert you that the mothership is in range, and this light over here will start blinking. You can fly high and booster up to get to full energy and drop off any pilots you've rescued. If you've rescued your quota for the current level, you can advance a level, though you could also choose to advance a couple more if you're feeling daring. The Lucasfilm games on the Atari 8-bit had this pretty neat sounding pitch bend at the beginning that sounded impressive on the old system. It's very reminiscent of the Lucasfilm THX sound intro called Deep Note that they started using in theaters just a couple of years earlier. The sounds in the game add a lot of depth to it. In particular, all of the sounds from your ship. You hear your ship's engine while you're flying, it changes pitch as you move around and speed up or slow down, it winds down as you land and fires back up as you take off, or before you start a mission. The shields also make energy sounds, like when you get near or deflect off of ground or the mountains, and a loud deep sound if a turret shoots you. There are the little blips as you detect and then approach downed pilots, as well as the rapid blipping when you're in range to pick one up. There's also rapid tick sounds as one of the enemy gun emplacements gets a lock on your ship. There's a noticeable thrumming sound when your system is active that's even more noticeable when you turn them off and hear that nearly deafening silence while you're on the ground. You can actually barely hear the footsteps of pilots running up to your ship, followed by the much louder pounding on the airlock and the pilot climbing up a ladder to get in, accompanied by the air puffs of opening and closing the airlock. Seriously, I cannot emphasize how much the sounds in this game make it such an enjoyable experience and how this game's sound felt literally decades ahead of its time. It's also immersive, and having played the other versions of the game, most of which have very little sound at all, they come across as a very hollow experience in comparison. Just amazing work here on the Atari 8-bit version. For music, there's a theme that plays while you're on board the mothership waiting to take off. That's fairly memorable. I couldn't find a transcript of it anywhere except for the vastly simplified Commodore 64 version, so I created my own transcript for it. It actually sounds very similar to Wagner's Rite of the Valkyries. There's a slow dirge of a sort that plays when you lose. And there's a very short piece that plays when you complete a level. I know this game came out 39 years ago, or more, but seriously, if this game looks interesting to you and you don't know anything else about it, please go play the Atari 8-bit or 5200 version, like, right now, before watching further. Seriously, this section is going to spoil what was a big deal back when this game was new, so play at least through level 12 or so, and then you'll know what I'm going to talk about in a moment. This is one of those games that I played with my dad back when I was 7 or so. He was using the controller and I was handling the keyboard. We had a similar arrangement a bit later when Wing Commander came out in 1990. It was fun to play this way since I could pay more attention to the visuals on the screen, and I got to play a game co-op with my dad. Once my dad and I hit level 9, we had a tendency to just land and open the airlock so the pilot could just jump right in. Well, sometimes the pilot would have a green helmet and be an alien instead of a pilot. And if they got in, they would do a lot of damage and make the ship really hard to control. You'd have to hope that you'd survive long enough to booster up to the mothership to get the alien out of your ship. What happened next was my very first video game jump scare. If it was an alien instead of a pilot and you left the airlock closed, this would happen instead. When it happened to me the very first time, I literally fell out of my seat. I wasn't fast enough to get back up and turn the systems back on to fry the alien, and my dad and I lost the game. And before long, the aliens start getting smart and stop having a green helmet when they run up to your ship, so you can't even tell ahead of time. When these aliens pop up, I still get a little startled. The aliens popping up are even spooky in the dark. And for most of the game, there's so much sound while you're flying around and attacking and whatnot. But while you're waiting for a pilot to come up to the ship, it's so eerily silent. Every time a new pilot walks up to the ship, once the steps stop, I hold my breath. Why is it taking so long? Is it an alien? Ah, okay. It's a good pilot. Letting him in. That silence also makes the jump scare sting from an alien jumping up even more poignant. This is apparently the very first well-known game to use a jump scare like this. The Lucasfilm Games team attributed the idea to George Lucas, who thought it would be a cool addition to the game. Well, you're not wrong, George. Not only that, but they deliberately hid anything about it from their promos and sales information. This was a fantastic way to make the game even more memorable. I've seen lots of people online mentioning what happened the very first time they dealt with a jaggy alien jumping up on the screen as well. Also, remember when I mentioned that the manual said you should destroy ships after you rescue pilots from them? Well, if you don't, they might later reactivate their beacons and become aliens if you try to pick them up a second time. Even though there's technically no ending to this game, it always leaves me feeling positive about it when I play it. The few hours I've played recording for this video were a lot of fun, at least in the original version. I've always enjoyed playing it for a bit here and there many times over the years. This is easily one of the best 8-bit games ever created. The developers weren't allowed to put their names into the credits due to a policy from Atari at the time. 4 of them put their initials on the alien's shirt, just sideways so it might be mistaken for an alien language. Yep, totally not standing for Lauren Carpenter, David Fox, Charlie Kellner, and Peter Langston. The artist who created the alien artwork, Gary Winnick, didn't even put his own initials on the shirt. The only bug I could find is really hard to miss, and I'm being really nitpicky calling it a bug. I only found it while trying to fill out my script because I was prodding around in the game where most people wouldn't be prodding. In fact, I found out 4 new things about the game in such a short time it was actually quite exciting. First, as I mentioned in the description, I found out that you go invisible to enemies if you are landed and turn off your system. This actually makes sense as it was even mentioned in the manual. Here I show the gun emplacement clearly targeting me, getting a lock, and hitting me while my systems are on, but the moment I turn them off, they stop. While your systems are off, the day-night cycles still go by, which is how I got the video of the sped-up day-night cycle without having to move. It's kinda calm, especially since I don't have to deal with the acid destroying my ship like Lieutenant Malura did. Secondly, I also noticed the game is completely paused when your airlock is open. I was trying to see if you would die if you left the airlock open for too long, and let many minutes go by. Nothing can happen other than a pilot running up to your ship while your airlock is open. The day-night cycle doesn't even progress. This is probably intentional so the developers didn't have to worry about messing with the colors of the pilot as they ran up to you. And what kind of weirdo would just hang out with their airlocks open for several minutes? Though I personally would call this a bug when it pauses the game and there is no pilot involved. Third, if you close your airlock, the game is still technically paused. The day-night cycle still doesn't progress. I bet this is, again, back to the colors of the pilot problem, but it also comes across as a bug since you can use it when there isn't even a pilot involved. If you flip your system on then off, time starts passing again. I can't imagine very many people would ever notice it, but while I'm here just recording nothing happening, I noticed the 4th new thing. There's a screensaver mode. If you just sit around long enough, the screen colors start changing randomly. Now, I don't know if this is using the built-in Atari OS Attract mode to do the color changing, or if it's in the game itself, but I never knew this could happen. There is a cracked version of the game that gives you infinite life, so I figured I'd try to find the edge of the map with it to see if anything interesting happens. This game is sped up here, but if you watch it for a little bit, you'll notice it actually just wraps around. And it's not even a particularly large map, so there is no actual edge of a map. I tried speeding up the Atari CPU in an emulator to see if we can get a higher frame rate, which you can do with some graphical glitches. This was done in Altera using a 65C816 processor instead of a 6502C. It seems there are some minor display issues in places with the text, and the way that the display interrupts are done seems to have some issues as well. Unfortunately, the more we speed the CPU up, the more flickering we get. At 2x speed, the game looks pretty nice at 15 to 20 frames per second, except the background occasionally flickering. At 4x, it's pretty annoying, even if we're getting around 25 to 30 FPS or updates every 2 to 3 frames. At 8x, it's super flickery and isn't even running that much better than 4x, though that would certainly necessitate hitting an update every frame to get to 60 FPS. If it weren't for the flickering, the 2x or 4x speed looks pretty nice. Rainbow Arts and Lucasfilm remade Ball Blazer for the Amiga in 1990 and named it Master Blazer. In the intro is this credit sequence with flying around solid red mountains, very much like Rescue on Fractalus. It makes me sad that neither an Atari ST nor an Amiga version were ever released for Rescue on Fractalus, because it looks pretty nice here at 320 by 200 and even runs at a decent frame rate of about 12 FPS. Before I get started showing the various versions of the game, I want to warn everybody with photosensitivity that flashing colors and the screen flashing happen a lot here. And most of these also run at a very low frame rate and may make some viewers sick. This is just how the games were, unfortunately. In 1984, a prototype of the game was distributed supposedly by someone at Atari before the final version was completed. This was named Behind Jaggy Lines. I found out I have a copy of it on accident. It was on my Rally Speedway disc for whatever reason, and it is definitely a simpler version of the game. There is no intro sequence, and the game lets you pick any level from 1 to 99. When you get into the actual game, it's nearly the same as the release version, except the pilot radar doesn't rapidly bleep or flash when you are close enough to pick up a pilot. Since I can pick any level, sure, let's try 99, and oh god, there's so many! Help! Help! No! Arg! So I lowered it to a level I'm more familiar with, 20, and that felt more like my normal experience with the game. It took a while, but I even found an alien pilot that waited very little time before breaking into my ship and killing me. So, yep, this is basically the beta release just before they did the final release. Neat. Too bad someone leaked it and probably lost the developers a lot of sales when it did finally come out. A prototype version of the game was created for the Atari 7800 in 1984. It was never completed so far as I'm aware, and what you see here is all I could get functioning with it, and it took hours to even get that. The only version I could find was a cracked or hacked version that changed some of the text, such as occasionally showing B Blazer sucks referring to Lucasfilm's previous game Ball Blazer. And for the record, Ball Blazer really did not suck at all. It was actually really cool, but I'll talk about it briefly later. For some reason, there are scan lines through the middle of the view screen. Reading online, the cartridge apparently had a custom 2KB chip inside to render that part of the screen, and it supposedly looks a lot better on a real 7800, which I don't have. Not that I have an extremely rare prototype cartridge either. I couldn't seem to fire at enemies, land, pick up pilots, or do much but fly. The cockpit has been updated, though most everything here doesn't function yet. The bottom right range, enemy counter, and the pilot counter slide out on load though, which is a neat touch. Anyways, it looked like it could have been a neat version, but there's not a lot to show here. Here is the Commodore 64 version, released by Lucasfilm and Epix in 1985, though the intro screen credits as soft talent. The intro music is quite different and greatly simplified. It only vaguely sounds like the original. I really don't care for it. The whole start sequence is missing, you just get this screen, and I couldn't figure out how to skip that on the disc version. The Lucasfilm logo is there as well at the beginning, but sounds far less impressive. Taking off looks almost identical to the Atari 8-bit version, complete with the changing curvature of the planet. Getting into the game and playing it feels about the same as the Atari 8-bit version, though the sounds are a bit different and less impressive sounding. The game moves slowly, only at about 3 frames a second, and the controls feel a bit floaty because of it. It's even harder to hit base encampments here, and when an alien jumps up, it has a completely different sting that reminds me of the chime for Akuma from Karateka. Though the game plays just fine in the CCS64 emulator, in WinVice, right away I noticed little graphical glitches, like wrong pieces of memory showing in the view screen. This showed up in all 3 versions I found in WinVice C64. It looks like little bits of the little lights at the bottom of the screen are showing up in the wrong places. In the tape version, they were showing up in different places, but they were still there. And after destroying one of the incoming saucers, a ghost version flew off to the right side of the screen. This is the Apple II version, released by Lucasfilm and TMQ Software Inc. in 1985. It's a product of reduced graphics and sound and speed that just does not add up to a very good experience. Instead of a starting sequence, here we just get a single screen in the music. The theme song is here in 2 tones, but it's closer than the Commodore 64 version. As you descend, the planet looks completely static, though I guess this prepares you for the cheaper feeling experience. In fact, one time, the frame rate completely tanked while I was going down to the world in this version. During flight, there is no thruster sound at all, and very minimal sounds. There are a couple types of ticking sounds, shooting, and the sound of hitting enemies. When you stop to pick up a pilot, as they approach you, it sounds like the sound of trains entering or leaving a station in Agent USA on the Apple II. Then they make the most feeble knocking sound. When you take off, there's absolutely no sound whatsoever. Overall, the sound is very lackluster and is really missed in this version. And this is ignoring the graphics, which are very dithered. Everything is pretty hard to see due to how fuzzy the dithering made things. The mountains fade a bit as you get really high and darken as night approaches, at least. When it's really dark, it is completely pitch black, just like the original. The game throughout had a very low frame rate, even compared to the original. It was taking about 20 frames per redraw for a whopping 3 frames a second, about half the speed of the Atari version. Controlling the ship was done through the joystick, but it was so slow to respawn. There were times a motion I had tried to do over a second ago would finally show up before being adjusted. To top it off, the game loved pulling to the left constantly, unless I tapped to the right before stopping movement, though this may have been an emulator issue. Aiming was very difficult as I had to swing back and forth, fighting the huge control delay. As I was playing, I kept hoping for an alien to come up to my screen. Please, end my misery. When one finally did break through my screen, the failed music kinda played, and then I could put my name into the high score list. This was the only thing that was responsive at all, so I was a little surprised by it and typoed on Zor. Whoops. Like the Atari 8-bit version, an Atari 5200 version was created in 1984 by Lucasfilm and Atari. Because Jack Tramiel bought Atari around the same time and who knows what other reason, this version was not released until 1986. The Atari 5200 is nearly identical to the 8-bit computers, so it should come as no surprise that this looks, plays, and sounds exactly like the computer version, albeit without the intro sequence. There really is nothing new here to look at. It plays just fine, though I did have to use the manual to figure out how to do things like land, turn off my systems, and take off, since Atari 5200s don't come with keyboards. The Amstrad CPC version was released by Lucasfilm and Activision in 1986. Aside from showing Lucasfilm, there wasn't a title after the game loaded, it immediately went into the level gate. The theme music sounds pretty good here actually, with a lot of bass, though with a few changed notes. The curvature of the planet shifts in this version as well, so it looks pretty good. While flying, this lumbers along, taking about 20 frames per update or about 3 frames a second, just like the Apple II version, though it has so many things better than that version. It is solid colors like the original, though more vibrant. The terrain has a very noticeable spike pattern to it, especially at low altitudes, that really reminded me of a similar spike pattern seen in the later Captain Blood on the Atari ST. There are a lot more varied sounds than the Apple version, such as a sound when you're flying around, and the controls with the joystick were really responsive even with the low frame rate. Once you landed, pressing S didn't always shut off your system, so be careful you don't turn them back on while the pilot's heading your way and murder them. There are other problems though. The game feels like it's moving a bit slowly, especially with the enemy saucers. The sounds fight with each other a bit since only a single sound seems to be possible in this version. Often, I'd have a chunk of a mountain flipping out, showing and then not showing, but apparently my ship was also rubbing against it as I was flying, making this weird chafing sound. The alien breaking through your window looks pretty decent, though the alien experiences some tearing here. A bit of a slow-feeling port with some minor problems, but with the responsive controls, it wasn't all a bad experience. The ZX Spectrum version was released by Lucasfilm and Delali Software in 1986. There is no intro, you just start on the mothership with a really awful single-note version of the theme song that had so many bad and out-of-tune notes in it, it's only barely recognizable. The launch sequence is very simplistic looking, but you do see the familiar edge of the planet with the changing curvature as you descend. Once in the game, it takes about 16 frames per update, getting about 4 frames a second. The view area is only 2 colors that are generally yellow and orange, but turn cyan and blue when you or an enemy gets hit. The gun emplacements and their shots are done with vertical lines to emulate another color, but they're often really hard to see. The controls are not good even with a controller, and I felt I was constantly fighting with them. The sounds are very minimal, with only simple clicks and tones or white noise. Like the Amstrad CPC version, the sounds fought with each other too, since only one could happen at a time. Also like the Amstrad CPC version, the ground has a lot of spikiness to it. Spiky, 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 spiky. I don't really feel there's a lot left to say here. I thought this version was pretty bad, and then I played the TRS-80 CoCo version. Oh boy. This is the TRS-80 color computer version created by Lucasfilm and Epix, released in 1987. Like anything on the CoCo, getting this to work was a challenge, but I finally got it to work through the MESS emulator, only to find out that this is a really bad port of the game, to put it lightly. The cockpit is a bit different, in pink nonetheless, with more bevels and with more dials at the top that do absolutely nothing but fill out some of the blank area. Approaching the planet, the curvature is static, not a great start. The frame rate is awful, taking around 25 frames per refresh, giving us an astounding 2 to 2.5 frames a second. The terrain looks especially flat compared to other versions as well. Oh my goodness, the way that the pilots run up to you, they appear they have a serious limp, and until they get very close, their left arm is completely chopped off due to how it renders on their approach. And it took so darn long. Enemy turrets are almost impossible to see, just a pixel here. The saucers are mostly a solid dark green as well, jitter around a bit, and love just randomly vanishing. Oh, and the alien looks a bit different here, but not too bad at least. The sound is bad, like internal speaker bad. I don't know if this was a problem with the emulator or the CoCo 3 had awful sound or what, but it's pretty bad. Yep, that's the theme music, kind of. This is launching, and this is waiting forever to a pilot to reach the ship. And seriously, sometimes over 25 whole seconds from system off to the pilot knocking. Hear that sound? Yeah, that's them knocking. There's only 3 different blip sounds this version seems capable of, and that's all you get. But even worse than all of that is how horribly the controller is handled. It decreased movement slowly over time when you let off for 5 to 10 seconds after you changed what you wanted to do. Turn to the left, then you noticed you need to turn right instead. Well, time to wait a while for that. Did you land and need to turn towards the ship? Gotta wait forever as it moves and hope it doesn't scroll too far past the ship. So, player, do you have to shoot an enemy? Fire randomly around and good luck! Whenever you hit a flying saucer, the screen flashes to show you hit it, but it takes another second for it to stop flying and making sound. And at one point, I don't know if this is the emulator or the game, but I was stuck on auto fire and had to land before it finally stopped shooting constantly. At another point, I let a flying saucer hit me, and the game started acting wonky like I was bonking into terrain a lot randomly. There is a, I think, fan-made update that's called a 6809 optimized version available as well. Now, while the game did feel like it ran a bit faster, it only got up to an amazing 3 frames a second and introduces all sorts of other weird problems. It felt like it was randomly speeding up and slowing down how you were moving, and at one point an entire mountain range in front of me just vanished. The wonky timing didn't help matters at all. At the end of my test, I noticed this pilot was actually an alien. It took a very long time to reach me, just like all of the other pilots. All I wanted was to be put out of my misery. Anytime now, I'll wait. At least the alien looks sufficiently weird here. A fan remake has been made by a Luke Arnold, and the final version was released for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux in 2020, though earlier alphas were available as early as 2010. Right off, it has a fully 3D model that looks just like the mothership shown in the Atari version, which is pretty cool. A synthesized version of the Commodore 64 theme plays a bit slower and with a lot of reverb. Like, I know why they chose the Commodore 64 version, because MIDI versions of that have been available and not the original Atari version, at least until I transcribed the Atari version myself. However, this just makes me sad because 1, it's a boring simplified version of the theme, and 2, I really disagree with their choice of instruments here. When you think of space, you think of brass instruments, not strings. Using my transcription, you get something like this instead. Starting up the game has a sequence very much like the original. I'm not a fan of the world looking like a low-poly ball of stone with no atmosphere. It looks very cheesy. It should have looked like a smoky ball of yellow, the color of Fractalus' acidic air. Once I gain control, I want the flight stick Y direction inverted. I just keep running into things otherwise, but pressing escape does nothing. I eventually give up and exit with Alt F4, not a great start. It turns out that if you're using a controller, all of the keyboard controls are locked out. I can't skip the intro cut sequence, I can't use any of the menus or get the menu from the game while a controller is set up. In flight, the ship banks side to side very hard without any normal way to manually roll. You press side to side and then have to wait until the ship rights itself. It felt very unnatural to fly this way, and I regularly ran into terrain or made very silly looking landings while playing. You could even have the ship go completely upside down, which just shouldn't happen. Controlling the ship was a lot more aggravating in this version. While flying, I tried the throttle control a bit while playing, and the highest speed is too fast. Landing near pilots, they really book it to get to your ship, though they don't look different if they're aliens, and I never found an ace, but they apparently exist in this version. It uses a bit of a retro sci-fi movie aesthetic, and it's quite silly feeling for it, but it was amusing to see the game this way. The suicidal flying saucers in particular look very campy, reminding me of old B-movie UFOs the way they bob around, and because of this I could almost never hit the darn things. One time a saucer bounced along the ground, which made it look like a skipping stone, but at least it didn't clip through the ground. The turrets require a lot more precision to hit, but at least that makes sense. The aliens also look like B-movie style animatronic aliens, just very goofy looking, but they do evoke completely the wrong mood when you laugh when they pop up instead of being spooked by them. They also didn't have the music sting when they pop up. Not a fan. On the other hand, throughout the game, it ran very smoothly at a full 60 FPS the entire time, and there were no loading times other than the initial asset loading bar. I really liked the throwback to the original shown in the cockpit with the targeting system. Most of the flashing lights in the cockpit match the original game's console, though there are now labeled regions off on the left that highlight when they're applicable. This makes the 3 similar lights on the right side no longer necessary. When you return to the mothership, it actually shows as you approach at breakneck speed to fly into an available hangar bay. If we look back at the art included in the manual, we can see that this is actually a very close approximation to what is shown. Here we can see the console of the ship, a pilot, and the blue and yellow artificial horizon. Even though the saucers look kinda silly, they do look very similar to the image in the manual as well. It's not perfect, but this is a much better reimagining of the game than I expected, other than my nitpicks, and it's free. Good job, Luke Arnold. A link for it is included in the description. I created a comparison chart already, which is in a separate video. It doesn't look great at 480p, which is what this video is using, so instead of including it here, I'll just link to it in the description. Check it out if you want to see and hear the differences in the various versions in one place. Sequel, Return to Fractalus, was planned by LucasArts in Factor 5 to be released on the Amiga in 1991 or so. Not far into the project, however, they determined that what they wanted to do could not be done with the hardware available at the time. By 1994, they felt that hardware was finally getting advanced enough for the game they wanted to make, and started working on it. Oddly enough, it wasn't an actual sequel that ended up getting released, but instead it morphed into a Nintendo 64 game, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, released in 1998. The open movement and fractal-generated terrain are about all that link this game's roots to Rescue on Fractalus. Back to the original, the same team also created 2 other games using the same engine as Rescue on Fractalus, which were also released in 1985, Coronis Rift and the Eidolon. And, just like Rescue on Fractalus, both of them are quite unique games. Interestingly though, both of these alternate titles also include code and sound designed by Douglas Crockford, the programmer for Galahad and creator of JSON that we talked about back in episode 2. Before I start talking about Coronis Rift, I didn't notice that I had lost the audio on all of my recordings until I was putting this video together. I tried to re-record the game, but after dying over and over at the beginning of the second level, I just cannot get myself to do it. I cannot stand playing this game, so all of my old silent recordings will have to do past the first level. In Coronis Rift, you are using a rover of a sort to travel along the ground, searching for abandoned hulks of lost technology. Here, though the more distant mountains and hills have different colors, the viewport still looks largely like Rescue on Fractalus. Your rover has 6 slots that can use different modules for different powers, some very unique, some detrimental, and some apparently required to succeed. You can get new shields, new guns, power generators, special types of radar, and all sorts of weird and unknown things, many of which don't seem to do a lot. You have a shiny robot up on your ship to help you analyze them, though generally you don't learn much about them. The HUD also has a lot of information as you're traveling, just like in Rescue on Fractalus, though I'd love to have some actual numbers for most of the data. While you're exploring the 20 different rifts, there are these really annoying UFOs that are constantly bobbing around and harassing you once they appear. Sometimes you have to deal with multiples at a time. On paper, this game sounds amazing, so I have tried many times to play through it and enjoy it and just end up hating it because it feels so unfair. I kept trying and dying over and over. The game doesn't really offer much assistance about what you are doing wrong, and I just gave up on this one after hours and hours of trying. I even jumped ahead to the final rift just to see if I could survive very well to the end, and the answer to that is a resounding nope! The Eidolon had the mountains of Rescue on Fractalus turned upside down and a black floor added, making it into a unique first-person shooter across 8 levels. This is a neat game that I've actually completed, but it's pretty hard, especially on the later levels. You are in a strange contraption that has 4 types of fireballs it can fire with different abilities, like the blue ones freeze things and the green ones transform enemies, though you usually just use the red ones because they're the cheapest and can actually kill normal enemies. There are also fireballs hovering around you can pick up, though some are bouncing around the corners and will hit you if you don't catch them properly. In each level is a unique dragon that is guarded by a set of up to 3 colored crystals that are guarded by sentry enemies that are frozen until you wake them up. Each enemy is a bit different, though there are repeats across levels, and they're all quite cartoony. Like this alien called a grep, whose eyes bug out when you shoot it, or this hovering trumpet fish thing called a pufferbird. The neatest one is this trio of blobs that aren't even in the manual that just stand still and play music. You can even move away from them and hear this music as you travel around, though the speed they play their music is based on the frame rate, so it sounds a bit silly at times. Check out some of these dragons, though. You could really see Gary Winnick's artistic style in them, such as this one who is very similar looking to the alien from Rescue on Fractalus, as well as the similarity between this dragon and the dragon in Loom, which they released much later in 1990. The very last dragon is a 7-headed giant with each of the previous dragon's heads on it that you have to defeat one by one, that has a giant blob of a body, and this fight totally reminded me of the final confrontation with Omadon in Flight of Dragons, where Peter Dickinson was using science facts to will dragon heads out of existence, or something like that.
Could be real.
There is a Fractalus on Steam that is nothing like Rescue on Fractalus and has nothing to do with it at all. Though the game was ported to many systems, I have no idea how well it sold. Rescue on Fractalus was actually completed in 1984. The manual even makes mention that the year the game takes place is supposed to be in 2184, with the mention of just 84, both references to when the game should have been released. Beta versions of Rescue on Fractalus, as Behind Jaggy Lines, and Ball Blazer as Ball Blaster, were given to Atari. Someone there leaked these beta versions of the game very shortly thereafter, so pirated versions of both games were available back in 1984. However, due to red tape at Atari, especially with it changing hands at the time, caused the game's release to be pushed back until April of 1985, and the 5200 version was pushed back until 1986. The games were pushed back so far, and so few copies ended up getting sold because the beta versions were already being handed around for a year or more before they were officially released. Because of this, all of the Lucasfilm projects after 1985 had as little to do with Atari as possible, and they shunned the Atari 8-bit computers. In the manual are a few photos showing pilots in spacesuits. One of them is a photo that includes most of the team that created Rescue on Fractalus. After a bit of searching, I found out who is who. Charlie Kellner, Lauren Carpenter, David Levine, Peter Langston, Noah Falstein, and Gary Winnick. David Fox isn't even in this picture, and Noah Falstein wasn't a part of the team behind Rescue on Fractalus. But seriously, how does Lauren Carpenter look exactly the same 35 years later? What is your secret, Lauren? Oh, I found more photos that weren't used in the manual on Peter Langston's site. These are so cool to see after all these years. We even have a picture of David Fox here dressed up in a spacesuit, presumably for Rescue on Fractalus. Cool stuff, thanks a ton, Peter. Anyways, to discuss the people behind this game, I'm just going to run through them in the same order that they're listed in the manual. David Fox was the project leader and designer for Rescue on Fractalus. He handled creating the documentation and also worked on some of the transitions in the game. That might be why he wasn't in the group photo. Before being hired at Lucasfilm, he and his wife opened the first public computer center called Marin Computer Center, or MCC, in Marin County, California. David apparently really wanted to work at Lucasfilm and wanted to stay in the area when he and his wife debated moving to Oregon because regulars at MCC worked at Lucasfilm. His plan worked because he got hired by them in 1983. While working there, he also worked on Maniac Mansion, Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, and Loom. In 1992, he left Lucasfilm and worked for various other companies such as Rocket Science Games, Zulu Entertainment, and Disney Imageering. His website, Electric Eggplant, hosts several mobile apps and books, and he also released RubeWorks, the official Rube Goldberg invention machine, on mobile and Steam. He now is working with Terrible Toy Box with Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick, and has helped with games such as Thimbleweed Park and Return to Monkey Island. Lauren Carpenter worked at Lucasfilm as a 3D specialist, in particular using fractals to generate realistic-looking terrain. In 1982, along with Robert L. Cook, he developed REYES, or Renders Everything You Ever Saw Rendering, which was first used in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. The Reyes rendering method was so robust that it was used by RenderMan, which he helped develop, until 2016. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a list of what specifically was rendered with the Reyes method other than this scene in Star Trek II, but the RenderMan software itself was used to create a slew of high-end CGI scenes in films over the last several decades, in movies such as Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, Aladdin, and in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as many of Pixar's own fully CGI movies such as Toy Story and Monsters, Inc. In fact, Lauren co-founded Pixar and worked there as the chief scientist until he retired in 2014. For Rescue on Fractalus, the story from David Fox goes that he worked in the same office as Lauren, and David once mused out loud that it'd be nice if Lauren's fancy 3D graphics could be used on a microcomputer in real time. Lauren said he thought he could do it, borrowed an Atari 800, learned 6502 assembly, and in a few days came up with a working fractal-based 3D engine on the Atari 8-bit, which ended up being the core display for Rescue on Fractalus. Charlie Kellner did the music and the sounds for Rescue on Fractalus. Awesome job, by the way, Charlie. Awesome job. As well as some of the programming for it. Before joining Lucasfilm, he invented Alpha Centauri, a digital music synthesizer, while working for Apple Computers. This synthesizer was used in the movie Tron, and supposedly played music at Steve Wozniak's wedding. Charlie has mostly done programming jobs for companies like Epix, Viacom, Ask Jeeves, Microsoft, Wizards of the Coast, and Nintendo. For games, he's worked on the Eidolon, Maniac Mansion, Sewer Shark, and The Pagemaster, amongst others. He is currently self-employed and lives a couple hours north of me up in Everett, Washington. Gary Winnick is known for his unique playful art style, which only shows up a little bit in Rescue on Fractalus, especially with the alien. But anyone familiar with the LucasArts games will recognize his style right away. Before Lucasfilm, in 1974, he founded Horizon Zero Graphique with Frank Sirocco, where he was an editor, writer, and artist for the comic Venture. He was quite busy at Lucasfilm Games, contributing a lot of artwork for the Eidolon and Cronus Rift, before creating Maniac Mansion with Ron Gilbert. After that, he was promoted to art director and basically contributed artwork to all of the Lucasfilm and then LucasArts adventure games, such as Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbender, The Secret of Monkey Island, Loom, and Day of the Tentacle. He also worked on Defenders of Dynatron City and co-wrote the Marvel comic of the game. In 1993, he left LucasArts and worked as the art director at Spectrum Holobyte before co-founding Orbital Studios, which produced Dino-Nauts animated adventures in space. In 1996, he returned as a partner at Horizon Zero Graphique, which was renamed to Lightsource Studios. And much later, he worked with his old LucasArts co-workers Ron Gilbert and David Fox at Terrible Toy Box to create Thimbleweed Park. His website, www.garyart.net, has not been updated in a long time, and it says his current project is Bad Dreams, which was released back in 2014. Considering Thimbleweed Park came in 2017, I'm not really sure what he's been doing since then. I can't really find out much about David Levine aside from a resume. The manual says he provided support for Rescue on Fractalus. He was the project leader and lead developer for Ballblazer, and his resume reflects that. After Lucasfilm Games, he worked for Macromedia, Silicon Graphics, Electronic Arts, and Incredible Technologies, amongst others. He founded Utopia Grockware with Ton Rundgren back in 1989, and seems to be running grockware.com, though there is very little here aside from links to a couple of their iOS games and whatever this is. Oh, it goes full screen. Okay. Peter Langston was the Lucasfilm Games group leader back when Rescue on Fractalus was created, and he contributed to the concept and design of night flying music and the sound. Before working at Lucasfilm, Peter had made a few free text adventures for Unix back in the 70s. Wander, which was originally released in 1974, is considered the earliest known text adventure complete with a text parser. It's cool that a blog site called Retroactive Fiction has an updated version of this that runs in MS-DOS, so I can show a sample of this being played. He was hired at Lucasfilm Games in 1982 and worked with David Levine on Ballblazer and David Fox on Rescue on Fractalus. Because of the mismanagement at the hands of Atari that I brought up earlier, he left the company shortly after that. He worked at Bellcore for a while, which is now known as Inconctive, before he retired in 1991. He's been doing consulting since, as well as working on various music projects and with various groups. He's the coordinator for the Puget Sound Guitar Workshop, a director for the California Bluegrass Association Music Camp, and a teacher for the website Rhythm Strummer. He also is a part of the Wretched Refuse String Band and Pete's Elite's Jug Band. He used to post quite a lot of music on his YouTube channel, but the last video there was posted almost a year ago. Lucasfilm Games was founded in 1982 by George Lucas to help develop video games, hence the name. The story of the first several years of this company are basically the story I painted above with the people behind these games, and ending with them cutting ties with Atari. Their next hit after the split was Maniac Mansion, created by Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick in 1987. It used a scripting language called Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, or SCUM, S-C-U-M-M for short. This became the basis of many other adventure games that we've already mentioned, like The Secret of Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, The Graphic Adventure, Full Throttle, and Sam & Max Hit the Road, all of which were fairly popular adventure games. In 1990, the company rebranded itself as LucasArts, with a confusing period in between where both names were used, as we could see in the intro to Loom here. Not only were they making adventure games, but they also started releasing Star Wars and Indiana Jones-themed action games as well, such as X-Wing, Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures, Star Wars Dark Forces, and so on. They made many other games as well, such as Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Metal Warriors. In the late 90s, the popularity of adventure games was wearing thin, but they still released The Curse of Monkey Island in 1997, Grim Fandango in 1998, and lastly, Escape from Monkey Island in 2000. There were plans for a Full Throttle and a Sam & Max sequel, but those were both cancelled. The creator of Sam & Max, Steve Purcell, as well as several of the programmers that had worked on its sequel, left the company in 2005 or so to form Telltale Games and produce an episodic version of the game themselves. So I was going to show just a couple of seconds of Sam & Max Season 1 in here, and I cannot even play it. I owned this game. I bought it back when it first came out because my wife was a big Sam & Max fan. And because Telltale Games is now defunct and doesn't exist, it sits and tries to connect and fails and then blames me because their website doesn't exist to authenticate my key. I just... Okay. Okay, anyways, back to talking about Lucasfilm. Aside from releasing mostly Star Wars games and occasionally re-releasing their old adventure games, LucasArts barely resembled the company it was in the 80s and 90s. They released so many games after 2000, and I could just rattle off names for a long time. In 2012, Disney bought the rights to Lucasfilm and subsequently LucasArts. In 2013, Lucasfilm shuttered its video game division, laying off most of the LucasArts staff, leaving just enough to handle licensing. Starting with the trailer for Return to Monkey Island, and later with the trailer for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, I've been seeing the Lucas Games logo appearing again, though Steam doesn't even list them as a developer or a publisher, so maybe it's just a label at this point. Maybe I should stop researching what happened to the creators of my fondest childhood memories. It's almost always so damned depressing. I really hate the modern ultra-conglomerates that buy up fun companies like this and just gut them or let them wither away and die.